Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 12th annual CLC Kreisel Lecture. My name is Marie Carrière, and I'm the director of the CLC. I'm very happy to see you all here. I would like to begin by acknowledging our location here at the University of Alberta, which is situated on Treaty 6 land, which is the gathering ancestral place of many Indigenous peoples, including the Papas Chase and the Métis Nation. L'Université de l'Alberta reconnaît qu'elle est située sur le territoire du traité 6, le territoire du Papas-Chasse et de la nation métisse. As we gather here and visit, we attempt to do so respectfully and ethically. I would like to do two things briefly and then pass on the microphone to my betters. First, I will ask you for money. And then I will thank some very important people who are here this evening. And so you'll have noticed on your way into the theater this evening the Pay What You Can station. And so I would like you to know that we very much appreciate your contributions, very much so. It's what allows us to do the work that we do and to continue to bring in these fabulous authors into Edmonton to pursue the research that the CLC pursues, to foster and promote Canadian writing, and to be part and a leader in the debates, the very important debates that are happening in our literary communities at the moment and that will continue to happen in the future. And so thank you so much for that. On that note, you will notice when you exit the theater to take part in the lovely reception that we have for you, which is catered by Kulina, that there will be a Pay What You Can Again station. I encourage you to visit the station again. And you will also find some pledge forms in your brochures this evening, and you can use that if that's more convenient for you. And so thank you again for that. Now on to some thanks. I would first like to acknowledge Dr. Eric Schloss, who is here this evening, who is the founder and benefactor of the CLC. And Dr. Schloss has been very generous with us over the years. He is the reason we are here, and I really want to thank you, Dr. Schloss, for your continued championing of the CLC. Thank you. Another person I would like to thank is the Dean of Arts, Leslie Cormack, and Dr. Cormack will come out in a few seconds to give some her own remarks and her own welcome remarks from the Dean's office. But I would like to thank her as well for her continued support of the CLC, her faith in the work of the CLC, and the faith that she has shown in me over the years. And so thank you very much, Leslie, for that. I would like to thank, of course, our CLC volunteers, and you will have seen them sort of around the house and outside in the lobby, those beautiful smiling faces. They're just wonderful. And there are two staff members whom I would like to thank in particular, and they are Anna Sejaki and Jason Purcell, and they should be here because I ordered them to be here so that we could applaud them. I did want to say that they are brilliant and they are funny and they make so much of this worthwhile. So thank you, Anna and Jason. One last thing before I leave you for now. We do have a Twitter hashtag. It is hashtag Kreisel18. And so you are more than welcome to tweet throughout the lecture. That would be lots of fun for those of us who are here and those of us who are not. And so with that, I will pass on the microphone to Dean Cormack. Thank you.
I am delighted, on behalf of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta, to welcome all of you here and to wish you a good evening. As many of you know, the Kreisel Lecture is an annual event that is housed by the Canadian Literature Centre, the Centre de Littérature Canadienne. This lecture was established in the memory of Professor Henry Kreisel. Professor Kreisel was chair of English and vice president academic at the University of Alberta in the 1960s and 1970s. He was also one of my mother's English professors in the 1940s when he was newly minted as a professor here. Austrian-born and Jewish, Professor Kreisel was interned in Canada during the Second World War. As a war refugee, he spoke of being an accidental immigrant to Canada and how, as a newcomer, he went looking for Canadian literature, but no one could tell him where to find it. So he took matters into his own hands, introducing and teaching the first courses in Canadian literature at the University of Alberta, inspired by a love of the written word in generations of students. He was also one of the first modern writers to introduce the immigrant experience to the field of Canadian literature. Indeed, it is one of his many legacies that only grows stronger as we continue to grapple with who we are as a nation. My first introduction to Henry Kreisel was as a high school student when I decided that I would write an essay comparing Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment with Henry Kreisel's The Betrayal. I was a bit of a geek, what can I say? The Betrayal is still well worth reading. I would recommend it to anyone. The annual Kreisel Lecture is a celebration of Canadian writing, but it's also a recognition of the importance of public intellectual exchange. In the Faculty of Arts, we're very proud to be the home of the Canadian Literature Centre. This successful research centre not only tackles key social, societal issues in its role as the Western hub of the Canadian literary community, it also works to bring together authors, readers, researchers, students, and teachers from across the country and in both of our official languages. And of course, the CLC continues to publish the highly acclaimed 18 Bridges literary magazine, most recently named Magazine of the Year in the 2018 Alberta Magazine Awards in March. Congratulations to the 18 Bridges magazine. I also would like to thank the people at the CLC who make all of this possible. Obviously, in particular, Dr. Marie Carrière, the director, and her team at the center. The Kreisel Lecture Series is successful because of its strong partnerships. I also want to give a good thank you to the University of Alberta Press, which co-publishes the Kreisel Series with the Canadian Literature Centre, and to CBC Radio Ideas team, who are here tonight recording the lecture for broadcast at a later date. And of course, I also would like to thank Eric and Alexis Schloss for their generous founding gift and also for their continued support of the CLC over the years. As many of you may know, Dr. Schloss was appointed to the Order of Canada in 2017, joining his wife, Alexis, appointed in 2014. So congratulations to Dr. Schloss, and thank you so much for your support. Now, my pleasure to welcome to the stage Professor Emerita Margaret Mackey, who will introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Mackey has taught and written in the interdisciplinary field of young persons' literacy and literature in both print and other media. She is the recipient of several prestigious awards for her scholarship, including in 2015 a Shirk Insight Grant, which she tells me she is still working on. In 2016, she published One Child Reading, My Autobibliography, with the University of Alberta Press, where she retraces and rereads almost everything she read from ages 2 to 13 as a child growing up in St. John's, Newfoundland. Seems very appropriate to today's speaker. Dr. Mackey, please come to the stage and introduce our speaker.
Hello, everybody. I'd like to begin, for particular reasons beyond the usual ones, by acknowledging that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory, the territory of the Pappas Chase and the homeland of the Métis Nation. The reason for doing this so particularly is that the beginning of my few remarks about Michael Crummey's work is such a terrible story that it just needs to be in here. Before I do that, I would like to thank Marie and my friends at the Children's Canadian Literature Center for the invitation to do this introduction, which is a great honor and a huge pleasure. In Newfoundland, as a school child in the 1950s, I learned that on June the 6th, 1829, the last Beothuk on the island, Shonadithit, died of tuberculosis. She was in captivity in St. John's. The settlers who had captured her named her Nancy, and I read about her in my grade 5 history book, The Story of Newfoundland and Labrador by Francis Briffett. It said, Nancy was the last of her tribe, and she died of tuberculosis, although everything was done to help her. Hugh Fanthorpe has written a poem about the Nativity called BC:AD. And in that poem, she speaks of the moment when before turned into after. As a 10-year-old in St. John's, I have to admit, I thought about the extinction of the Beothuk nation in exactly the same way. First they were around, then they weren't. And it wasn't until long after that, in 2001, when I read Michael Crummey's first novel, River Thieves, that I thought about that element of during, that liminal period when the Beothuk were gradually being wiped out, and the terms of their extermination or survival were the subject of settler debate, and no doubt a topic of great concern to the Beothuk themselves. Michael Crummey's Beothuk live largely in the margins of River Thieves. He doesn't presume to speak for them. They fade away. They're difficult to approach. They shrink under contact. These first inhabitants of Newfoundland haunt the book, and they've haunted me since I read it in 2001. They made the dreadful events of 1828 and 1829 more real to me, and in reading about this book, I came across a verb conjugation that makes much more sense than my own childish before and after. Paul Chafe talks about River Thieves in terms of the fundamental loss in Newfoundland's history, the originary moment when what could have been is separated from what is. At the same time, these Beothuk in River Thieves also drew my attention to the margin as a place of literary and psychological activity. All of Michael Crummey's books include the margins as places of unseen but active life. I find this achievement all the more poignant and telling as a Canadian Newfoundlander whose literary and historical childhood included a very powerful perception that all my own surroundings were inherently marginal and being further marginalized by other people. It's a very colonial perception, and it ranked high in my sense of my home and my place in the world. Crummey redeems that margin in many different ways, mostly from the perspective of assorted inhabitants of Newfoundland. But his margins are capacious, and they make room for other excluded characters, such as a bullied Japanese student in a Canadian school in The Wreckage. In Galore, the margin becomes a magical place, making room for a man found in the belly of a whale on the opening pages. Jonah, perhaps, or Jack, who was every inch a sailor, and who in one of the best-known Newfoundland folk songs was swept into the sea and swallowed by a whale. And Moses Sweetland fades into the margin before our readerly eyes as he resists relocation in the consolidation of Newfoundland's tiny communities into larger centres. Michael Crummey's pages work as hard as his margins, and almost as hard as his characters work. Labour is a dominating feature of life in Crummey's Newfoundland. The landscape is not benevolent. The climate is so infamous that, in fact, no fewer than 3 of the 4 verses of the Ode to Newfoundland mention the weather. This is factual. They really do. And the skills to wrestle a living from land and sea are very hard won. He observes, describes, and fully respects these skills. As a child in St. John's walking to school in the 1950s, I battled evil winds driving needle-sharp rain and stinging ice pellets into my face, apparently regardless of the direction I was walking in. I know this is uphill both ways to school, but I can quote now from Michael Crummey himself, saying that Newfoundland winds can indeed play this unnatural trick. He says, "There are days I've run the 360-degree loop around Kitty Vitty Lake and had the wind, physically impossible though you'd imagine it must be, slapping full on in my face the entire time." And I have to say, that validation of my own resentful memories was extremely important to me when I read it. Yes, absolutely. Maybe I'll show it to my children someday. Naturally, in these circumstances, even as a school child, I think every school child in Newfoundland is driven to ponder the existential history of Newfoundland, history and geography. How did anyone survive here? I'm sure the same question vexed him on his Kitty Vitty runs, but his books do supply some of the answer to that question. The people survived through brutally hard work and determination, slogging on through deprivation and hunger and unfair treatment. And yet, amidst such desperate scenarios, his characters are more than the sum of their deprivations. They engage comfortable 21st century readers in profound and delightful ways. So, who's the man who's created these worlds? His official CV gives the details that the outline sketch. He was born in Buckens in 1965 and moved to the mining town of Wabush near the Labrador-Quebec border in the late 70s. He attended Memorial University in St. John's and earned a Bachelor of Arts in 1987. Then he moved to Kingston, Ontario, where he completed a Master of Arts from Queen's in 1988. He then enrolled in the doctoral program at Queen's, but left to pursue a writing career. And he's now the author of 8 books of poetry, 1 book of short stories, a book of photographs and reflections about Newfoundland, and 4 highly acclaimed novels. His impressive list of awards and accolades is so lengthy that if I were to do it justice, I wouldn't be able to say anything else. So you'll have to look that up, but it is dazzling. Instead of doing that, I want to take a few minutes just to think about what it means to our culture that the real place, Newfoundland, is now also a place imagined by Michael Crummey. In a note in that book of photos, Newfoundland, Journey into a Lost Nation, which incidentally also features a great deal of insight into the labor that made existence possible on that island. In that book, he gives us some insight into the process of imagining in a very beguiling way. Buckens, he says, is so close to the island's center that provincial forecasts once used it as a convenient line of demarcation, predicting the day's weather in quadrants east of Buckens, west of Buckens, north and south of Buckens. I remember the thrill of that as a child, hearing the name of my hometown repeated so frequently and casually on television and radio. And beneath the thrill, a peculiar disquiet, as if the place were more imaginary than real, somehow a mapmaker's fiction, like the equator or the North Pole. I'm very taken with this combination of listening and imagining and astute thinking about the impact of that imagining. And I think it's very clear that he's able to convey that complex framing of his home country to other people. When I was first invited to make this introduction, I wrote to my friend and colleague Scott Pollard, who teaches literature at Christopher Newport University in Virginia in the United States, and who's an ardent Crummey enthusiast. Scott has Newfoundland relations, but he's always lived in the States, and he's seen Newfoundland only on visits. His testimonial as a reader of Michael Crummey works in ways markedly similar to those reflections on the place of Buckens in the weather forecast. This is what he wrote me. Crummey became the lens through which I looked and look at Newfoundland. And for all my distant roots in Newfoundland, and having known something about the island since I was a kid, when my grandmother would stink up the house with the capelin and fish and brews that arrived every Christmas, it's Crummey's magical narratives that shape my adult vision of the place. Other Newfoundland writers add to that magic, but Crummey's fiction created the frame. When I've been in Latin America, I've never felt that I was in the midst of a magical real world, although there are particular magical places. But in Newfoundland, I always felt that I was traversing a magic real geography, whether in the east, west, middle, or north. And all those times, you, of course, appreciate that he'd be east of Buckens and so forth. Perhaps coming to Newfoundland with the Crummey lens in place, I was given to readily experiencing the magical element of the island while ignoring the more mundane. Or perhaps Newfoundland is more magical than real, and Crummey simply puts the magical in focus, making it easier to see. My own thesis is that he sees Newfoundland both as a real focus of intense labor and hardship, and also as a kind of mapmaker's fiction or novelist's fiction, where the truest things happen in an imaginary setting. And I hope he's going to talk more about that tonight. To make room for this anomaly in his books, he includes the margins in the sleight of hand that makes the place both real and mysteriously strange. To those like myself, who grew up never seeing our home as imagined in any way that did justice to its epic geography and history, and also to those who, like my friend Scott, found their first encounters with Newfoundland through some deeply imagined version of the place, to all of us he's offered an enormous gift. His complex and persuasive characters, his wild and frustrating landscapes, his eerie flirtations with magic in the midst of an intensely realistic battle for survival, offer all of us new ways of thinking, not just about Newfoundland and about who or what today constitutes the marginal in Canadian and world literature, but about ourselves as well. and it's my privilege to present him to you tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Margaret, for that introduction. There are a lot of days, and I'm sure this is true for a lot of writers, it's hard for me to believe that anybody's actually out there reading these crazy books I'm writing. So it's gratifying to be in the company of somebody who's read them and thought deeply about them. So thank you for that. I'd like to thank Marie especially and the other folks from the CLC for their persistent invitation to me to come and be part of this series, which in a very short space of time, I think has kind of become an iconic series in Canadian letters. We'll see if that continues to be true after tonight. It's great to be back in Edmonton. It's been a number of years since I've been here, and I was just out wandering a little bit today and walking along White Avenue. There seems to be a lot more tattoo studios on White than I remember. I went by a place called Badass Tattoos. There's a big sign on the door. It said, $600, all you can handle tattoo. I'm not going to lie, I was tempted. I thought it would be a nice memento of my appearance at the Kreisel Lecture series. I passed in the end. I know my pain tolerance, and $600 seemed like a lot to drop for an I Heart Rachel Notley tattoo or something. I mean, knowing myself well enough, I probably wouldn't have even gotten through it. I would have gotten I Heart Rachel Not, and I would have had to stop. That's a totally different message. So, before I get into the lecture, I did want to do one more thing, and that is to bring greetings from Stan Draglin. Now, some of you will know Stan or know his work. Stan's an Alberta boy, now living in St. John's, Newfoundland, one of my best friends, but he's a University of Alberta graduate. And when he studied here, he studied with Henry Kreisel. But mostly I want to bring up Stan's name because I am going to be quoting him extensively in tonight's lecture. Probably true to say that all of the good bits in this year's Henry Kreisel Lecture will be me stealing things from Stan Draglin. So Stan says hello. Sometime last spring, while I was still wondering what the hell I was going to lecture about at the Henry Kreisel series, I was trolling through the cable guide and happened on what I thought was a showing of one of my favorite movies, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, on, of all things, the History Channel. For those of you who don't know, it's a film about a group of outlaws in 1890s Wyoming who turned to train robbing at a time when the so-called Wild West was fast disappearing. And it features one of the all-time great movie endings when Butch and Sundance, driven to Bolivia by the pursuit of lawmen, find themselves trapped in a mud shack under fire from local police. And as they reload for one final desperate break, a passing army column is informed of the bandidos Yankee who are holed up in town. And the camera cuts periodically then to dozens of riflemen taking up positions on the roofs surrounding the Americans. And when the two men finally charge into the village square, firing blindly, the film freezes. That last image of Butch and Sundance fades to sepia to the sound of repeated rifle barrages. I remember the shock of that on my first viewing of the film, that both main characters could be killed off so matter-of-factly. Hollywood would normally insert a miraculous escape and show the two men riding off into the sunset while the credits roll. And I had always assumed that the film was spared a Hollywood ending by history. There's a title card at the beginning of the film that claims, "Most of what follows is true," which I had always taken to mean actual events determined the shape of the story, including that final scene. But it wasn't the Hollywood film on the History Channel, I discovered. It was a documentary about the men behind the movie. And much of what the film depicts does have some basis in fact. Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang are historical figures who specialized in train robberies. They were regarded as folk heroes by local ranchers who were rapidly losing their farms and livelihoods to the encroaching citified world of the East, much of that development driven by expansionist train barons. The Pinkerton Agency was hired by Union Pacific Railways to hunt them down, driving the two men to Bolivia, where they spent the last years of their lives. They tried and failed to go straight. and they died in a hovel in an unnamed Bolivian village as a result. But that classic movie ending, it turns out, is not how things went in real life. The two men were holed up in a shack under fire from the local police force, but there was no military column passing by. There was no last dash for freedom. Things went quiet after dark. When the Bolivians broke in the next morning, they found the men dead. According to the documentary, at some point during the standoff, one of the two men shot the other man in the head and then shot himself in the head. Trapped like rats, and the only way out was a murder-suicide pact. A squalid, pathetic end without a single redeeming element. It forced me to rethink that word most at the start of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and to look at the final scene very differently. It seems the sepia-toned image of those two men running free into gunfire was a Hollywood ending after all. I remember at some point in my undergraduate English degree being told that fiction holds a mirror up to society, to the real world. And it's a notion close enough to our experience of reading that most of the time we skate past it without asking a lot of questions. But if I've learned anything over the past 30 years as a writer and a reader, it's that the line between the mirror of fiction and the reality it supposedly reflects is porous and shifting. It is true that in some barely definable way, the real world doesn't seem to fully exist until it has been fictionalized or told, until the mirror is held up and we see our own faces. In Annie Proulx's novel, The Shipping News, a character named Billy Pretty describes the harshness of living in Newfoundland in pre-Confederation days, noting especially the almost complete isolation they experienced. But Billy and his siblings were taught to read by their father, who would order random volumes of stories or children's books or school texts for them, including, in one instance, a book on volcanoes. Billy says, the last chapter in that book was about volcanic activity in Newfoundland. That was the first time anyone had seen the word Newfoundland in a book. It just about set us on fire that this place was in a book. In a long review article of Paul Bowdring's 1997 novel, The Night Season, a book he calls very much a St. John's book, critic Stan Draglin claims that a reader from away, supplied with a map, could easily follow the main character's movements through the city. And anyone familiar with St. John's would be able to identify idiosyncratic landmarks and details, such as the building, which is marked with definite article only, and the manufactured in St. John's Silent Night manhole covers. As Stan puts it, the existence of the parallel reality of the novel thickens the real of the actual city. The Night Season was published near the beginning of a literary outpouring in Newfoundland that would very shortly make a significant mark nationally and internationally. It's hard now to remember what things were like for local writers before Newfoundlanders began regularly appearing on major literary prize and best of the year and bestseller lists. In the late 1980s, when Bernice Morgan began trying to find a publisher for Random Passage, her seminal novel of early European settlement in Newfoundland, she had a literary heavyweight in her corner. Jack McClellan, former publisher of McClellan and Stewart, was acting as her agent. But even he felt the need to warn her that landing a deal with a big house was unlikely. At the time, mainland publishers seemed to be of the opinion that no one outside of Newfoundland would be interested in reading a story about Newfoundland. The world that mattered, the real world, was elsewhere. After a disheartening round of rejections, Morgan published Random Passage with Breakwater, a small independent press based in St. John's, in 1992. The following year, Annie Proulx's The Shipping News appeared. It went on to win the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, and sold something close to 1 bajillion copies worldwide. Leaving aside reasonable questions about why it took an American to make us interesting to mainlanders, it was very hard to argue after The Shipping News that no one outside of Newfoundland would want to read a book about Newfoundland. Publishers, in fact, were suddenly beating the bushes at home looking for local writers. And as luck would have it, there were a lot of writers in the bushes waiting for them. Wayne Johnson already had a reputation as a good regional writer, but his 1999 novel, The Colony of Unrequited Dreams, the first of his books to be published as a lead title by a major house, was a massive success. After languishing for a number of years, Bernice Morgan's Random Passage became an unlikely national bestseller and was adapted as a television miniseries. The Burning Rock, a group of young writers in St. John's, had been honing its knives for years by then, and Lisa Moore, Michael Winter, and Jessica Grant went from that sharpening stone to national and international notice. They, along with last year's Governor General's winner, Joel Thomas Hines, and this year's Canada Reads finalist, Sharon Balla, and literally dozens more, are in the process of creating a living literature where precious little existed a generation ago. That literary surge has been a stunning thing to witness and to be a part of. For what feels like the first time, Newfoundland stories are being read and celebrated, not just by ourselves, but by strangers abroad as well. And being seen and acknowledged in this way makes Newfoundland and my life within it feel more substantial, more solid, that this place is in a book. As Stan Draglin puts it, with the proliferation of its own literature, Newfoundland is getting more real all the time. As is the case with just about everything in life, the symbiotic relationship between the real world and the mirror of fiction is a bit of a double-edged sword. The notion of fiction as a mirror is altogether too passive to be accurate, for starters. Authors present the world in their heads, which is often different in substance and detail from the world a reader sees. When we read about a place or circumstance we know, we place the fictional world like a transparency over the map we've made of our own lives and experiences. Where there is disagreement between the two, there is discomfort, which can lead to learning, can lead to change, can lead to growth. But where learning or change or growth aren't in the cards, inevitably there is conflict. When Wayne Johnson published The Colony of Unrequited Dreams, he faced a firestorm of criticism about his fictional depiction of Joey Smallwood, the politician who brought Newfoundland into Confederation in 1949. Johnson, in fact, addressed that controversy in one of the first Kreisel Lectures in 2008. Smallwood is one of the most polarizing figures in Newfoundland's history, a populist politician who pork-barreled and bullied his way through a quarter century as our first premier. Those who supported the man saw him as a visionary, the little fella from Gambo who dragged Newfoundland kicking and screaming into the modern world. On the other side were those who despised Smallwood as a small-time despot, who maintained his hold on power with a whip in one hand and a treasury bankrolled by the feds in the other. Choosing Smallwood as the main character for a novel is pretty much guaranteed to piss off one side or the other. But Johnson managed the neat trick of pissing off both sides at once. His portrayal of Smallwood wasn't glowing enough to satisfy the evangelicals, and in the eyes of the apostates, it was an unforgivable whitewash. To both camps, the book misrepresented reality. And as bizarre as it seemed to Johnson, much of the criticism he faced came down to a fear that the novel would be mistaken for fact. On a radio talk show, he says, "I was asked how it felt to know I would be the cause of the miseducation and misinformation of future generations of Newfoundlanders, credulous children who would mistake my novel for a book of history. I replied that it was easy to tell a novel from a book of history because the words "a novel" appear on the cover of a novel." He is right about this, of course, but I can't help sensing a defensive edge in his dismissal. I've dabbled in historical fiction myself, and maybe I'm projecting my own defensiveness here, but I think the distinction between history and fiction isn't quite as simple or clear-cut as Wayne Johnson or I would like it to be. To illustrate just how hard it can be to draw a definitive line between what is real and what is fictional, we need look no further than Colony's other main character, the sharp-tongued Sheila Fielding. Fielding is a newspaper reporter who carries on a decades-long romance of a sort with Smallwood, alternately mocking and egging him on. According to many critics, Fielding is the most compelling character and the beating heart of the book. She is also completely fictional. There never was a Sheila Fielding or anyone like her in Smallwood's life. But according to Johnson, since the novel's publication, at least 3 women have come forward claiming to be the real-life inspiration for his creation. Much of Lisa Moore's earliest fiction, collected in Degrees of Nakedness and Open, is based on or borrows heavily from her own experiences. Everyone around her recognizes that, and often they recognize themselves or their friends behind the thin camouflage of fictional names and barely fictionalized settings. The real in her stories was so obvious that even when she pushed into completely fictional territory, people assumed there had to be a true story at the heart of it. In the opening story in Degrees of Nakedness, the narrator learns her husband had an affair while she was pregnant by overhearing a conversation on a baby monitor between him and the woman he had been sleeping with. After the book came out, Lisa's real-life husband began noticing a distinct change in how he was treated by Lisa's friends. No one wanted to talk to him on the phone. People turned their backs on him in public. Once the source of the problem was identified, Lisa was forced to make a public announcement that her husband had not, in fact, had an affair while she was pregnant. In all creative writing, the question of what is true and the question of what is real are 2 very different considerations. Figuring out how to dance between those 2, for writers and for readers, can be a murky business. I should acknowledge at this point that there is an argument to be made that a writer's only responsibility is to tell a compelling, convincing story. That fiction operates on a plane that, while it may look and feel something like them, is actually separate from the worlds of facts and history and is not beholden to them. Its only job is to hold a reader's attention. Bringing in issues of fact or history or authenticity are beside the point. I will also acknowledge that although my own practice has always been very different, I once believed this was a perfectly reasonable view for other writers to hold. And I can pinpoint exactly the moment I was forced, against my own inclinations, to revise my belief in this matter. I was at a literary event in the US almost 20 years ago, and I mentioned to a festival goer I was from Newfoundland, expecting the usual blank stare, but her face lit up. "Oh," she said, "I know all about Newfoundland." "You do?" I said. "Yes, absolutely," she insisted. "I just read The Bird Artist. Do you know it?" "I do know it," I told her. "And I hate to break it to you, but you know nothing about Newfoundland." Before I go any further, I feel the need to quote Kurt Vonnegut here, who once said, "Any reviewer who expresses rage and loathing for a novel is preposterous. He or she is like a person who has put on full armor and attacked a hot fudge sundae." Wise words. That should give any critic or any Kreisel lecturer pause. But the sorry fact of the matter, my friends, is that I am about to strap on a suit of armor and get medieval on a hot fudge sundae. So I invite you to take what follows with Vonnegut's words in mind. The Bird Artist is a novel by the American writer Howard Norman, published in 1994. It was well reviewed when it appeared and was nominated for the National Book Award in the United States. Ostensibly, the book is set in Witless Bay, a small outport on the Avalon Peninsula, shortly before the First World War. I say ostensibly because beyond using Newfoundland place names, the world of The Bird Artist bears absolutely no resemblance, and I am not overstating this, literally zero resemblance to the Newfoundland of the early 20th century. The narrator is Fabien Vasse, a young man who has found an escape from the oppression of his parents' unhappy marriage in drawing the local seabirds. And our troubles with the novel begin with him. On page 3, he tells us, "I discovered my gift for drawing and painting birds early on. I should better say, that someone had filled the margins of my third form primer with sketches. Now, let's leave aside the fact that the likelihood anyone in Witless Bay had a third form primer in 1912 is close to nil. It's Fabian's voice that rings completely false here. I should better say? Yes, Fabian, you really should. His mother, upon discovering her son's sketches, remarks that it is awfully nice to learn something so unmistakable about one's offspring. I am trying to imagine a situation in which any Newfoundlander, at any time in history, would refer to their own youngster as one's offspring. Everyone in the novel speaks in a mid-century, mid-Atlantic accent. When one of Norman's characters says, "I neither champion nor repudiate my life thus far," or "she kindly said she'd pick it up for me," or "Darling, can you buy a fish for supper?" It doesn't exactly scream what Norman elsewhere calls Newfie. In Norman's Newfoundland, there are villages rather than outports. People row dinghies instead of Rodneys or punts or dories. There's talk of someone shooting at raccoons, though there are no raccoons in Newfoundland. There are orchards and potluck meals and store-bought bottles of milk. There is a market where local fishermen, I kid you not, buy fish for their own supper. And here is my personal favorite. Fabian's father was born and raised in Buckens, my hometown. Doing some elementary math, that would mean he was born there somewhere between 1870 and 1880, which would be quite a trick since Buckens did not exist before the late 1920s, when the zinc mine opened there. Everyone in Norman's Witless Bay attends the local Anglican church, which is odd when you consider Witless Bay sits on what is known as the Irish Loop. The first official Newfoundland census was conducted in 1836, at which time Witless Bay had a population of 542, 540 of whom were Roman Catholic. The population has fluctuated in the years since, but that ratio has remained pretty constant. But there is not a single mention of Catholics in the novel. The driver of the mailboat in The Bird Artist is, we are told, part Beothuk. This despite the fact that Beothuk, the indigenous inhabitants of Newfoundland, were driven to extinction roughly 70 years earlier. Occasionally, the driver of the mailboat smokes a pipe of what is described as Beothuk Indian brain medicine. Fabian's father recalls encounters with Beothuks, stragglers he calls them, who spoke English and claimed to be baptized and ambled into town to buy fishhooks from the general store. One old Beothuk couple apparently had a pet parrot that spoke Beothuk words. As the Catholics of Witless Bay might say, in exasperation and disbelief, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Even with something as basic and obvious as the food people eat, the bird artist swings and misses. These people have freshly baked scones for breakfast, for Christ's sakes. I had never heard of scones before I moved to Ontario in my 20s. They drink coffee morning, noon, and night. Coffee, Fabian tells us, was what you came into out of the cold. No, you feckin' well did not. Tea is what Newfoundlanders drank. Coffee was almost as rare as scones in those days. For some incomprehensible reason, people fish for and eat a lot of sea bass in this book. It's the only fish Newfoundlanders can stomach, to judge by the bird artist. I have never seen or tasted sea bass. No one I know has ever heard of it being caught or served in Newfoundland. The codfish, the heart of the local economy and diet, the sole reason for European settlement in the first place, gets about as much acknowledgement as the Catholics of Witless Bay. Lobster also plays a prominent role in the book, despite the fact lobster was not a part of the local diet, except in dire circumstances. Now, this is a story so common that it's become a cliché. Only the poorest and most desperate families ate lobster because shellfish are bottom feeders. People often hid the shameful evidence of their desperation by burying the shells. But in Norman's 1912 Witless Bay, there is a chowder restaurant called Spivey's, where the signature dish is, you guessed it, lobster. The chef personally delivers the lobster dish to his customers, calling out "presentation" and holding the tray above his head as he moves through the tables. Then, with a flourish, he reveals the crustacean lying under a cloth napkin. Sometimes, Fabian tells us, this drew applause from the patrons. Again, I say, not feckin' likely. For most of the last 400 years, Outport Newfoundland operated on the truck system, in which a local merchant gave supplies and equipment to fishermen on credit, with the stipulation they sell their season's catch to the merchant. The merchant set the prices for the supplies given out in the spring and for the fish taken in the fall. In good years, a fisherman could expect to do slightly better than breaking even. It was not unheard of for people to spend their entire lives in debt. It was a subsistence economy in which there was no real surplus, in which cash money rarely figured. There were no restaurants where people paid for and were served lobster under cloth napkins. There were no general stores where people popped in to buy milk. Women did not use, as Fabian's mother does, skin creams from France. People made clothing and curtains out of burlap sacks so as not to waste the material. But Fabian's mother, a fisherman's wife, would, quote, spend a ritual half-hour standing in front of her closet, riffling through her dresses, greatly amused. Fabian's mother may be amused by the sartorial decadence at her fingertips. I, on the other hand, am not. But what does it matter, you may be asking? So what if he gets the details wrong? Does it hurt anything that naive readers will come away from this book believing residents of Witless Bay at the turn of the 20th century were quasi-bohemian, sea bass-eating, coffee-swilling scone aficionados who spent their abundant leisure time applauding lobsters at the local fine dining establishment? Am I being ridiculous to feel alternately infuriated and demoralized by the book? Norman isn't writing history, not even historical fiction in the way that, say, Wayne Johnson is in The Colony of Unrequited Dreams. The New York Times review of The Bird Artist referred to it as a fable, claiming its whimsical details lend it a fairy tale quality, which suggests we aren't mean to take any of this as a literal reflection of the world. And it may be that I am in the wrong here, that I am faulting The Bird Artist for failing to be something its author never intended. But it is impossible for me, and I think for anyone with even the vaguest sense of the realities of life in Newfoundland, not to feel insulted by the book's cavalier use of the place for its own ends. I know from my parents' stories what people endured simply to keep body and soul together in those communities. And it is disheartening to see their world appropriated by someone with so little regard for the most basic truths of those lives. What was the motivation for setting the story in this particular place if the particulars of the place are completely irrelevant and dispensable? If Paul Bowdring's engagement with the reality of St. John's in the night season helps to thicken the real of the place, The Bird Artist's complete disregard for the world in which it is set debases the real. It demeans and denies it. Newfoundland is just a superficially exotic location that the book divorces from every social, cultural, and historical artifact to suit its own pedestrian purposes. From start to finish, it is complete and utter bullshit. And I can't help feeling Norman is an arsehole to have written it. It wasn't just Wayne Johnson's portrayal of Joey Smallwood or the creation of a fictional love interest in the figure of Sheila Fielding that got him into trouble with readers of The Colony of Unrequited Dreams. He also got flack for exactly the kind of inaccuracies that caused me to foam at the mouth while I was reading The Bird Artist. Johnson places Smallwood as a reporter on a sealing ship during the Great Newfoundland Sealing Disaster in 1914, though Smallwood never went to the seal hunt. He has Smallwood walk on pack ice along the south coast, a part of the island where, for reasons of geography and prevailing currents, Arctic pack ice is never present. Smallwood's family home in St. John's is described as sitting on top of the brow in a, quote, saddle-like depression of the ridge, so that from the front you could see St. John's and from the back the open Atlantic. But Smallwood not only never lived on top of the brow, no one else did either. There's never been a house in that location. There are any number of other peculiar inaccuracies in the layout of St. John's streets and buildings in the book. Random Passage author Bernice Morgan says she was driven to distraction by the inconsistencies between the St. John's in the pages of Colony and the St. John's she has lived in her entire life. In 2001, Stan Draglin gave the annual E.J. Pratt Lecture at Memorial University, in which he addressed some of the controversy that surrounded the colony of unrequited dreams. Stan is one of the most insightful and most generous critics in Canadian letters, and his lecture, Romancing History, is a masterclass in how to approach the thorny questions that come up when the novel deviates from the real, both from the physical place in which a story is set and from the known history on which a novel is based. In Stan's view, no assessment of any departure from fact is complete without considering whether something else is served by it. As just one example, he looks at this business of the Smallwood family home on the Brow, which is a departure both from the historical record and from the reality of the city itself. It's a detail that some reviewers found particularly galling because it seemed so unnecessary. Why depart from the recorded facts of Smallwood's life, they asked, in a way that also thumbs its nose at the undeniable physical world? And they usually answered their own question by implying, only an arsehole would be so blatantly perverse. Stan instead asks, what does this departure serve? Is there a valid reason to put Smallwood's house where no house ever sat? Here is his answer. This is a symbolic setting, a pivot between two great physical realities of Newfoundland, the land and the sea, and between the city with its assertion of humankind, especially family, and the humankind negating sea. Nobody in St. John's actually lives in a house so situated, on such a stark edge between city and ocean. But somebody ought to, in a novel that dramatizes the human comedy against a huge backdrop of alien space and time. The Smallwood house is wrong then, he concludes. It's also right, a symbolic setting woven into the mythic fabric of the novel. So if I'm following Stan correctly, historical fiction, if it's done right, allows an author to eat their cake and have it too. Johnson's depiction of Smallwood himself is clearly wrong, whichever side of the Smallwood divide you stand on. But the intention never was to get Smallwood right in strict historical terms. The public facts of Joey's life, Stan argues, were a more or less empty vessel that Johnson filled with invented innards. And those innards, in my opinion, are Johnson's own love-hate relationship with the island and its history. The emotional world of Smallwood in the novel is an expression of Johnson's ambivalence and admiration, his disappointment in and his ambitions for the place that made him. To be fair, there are some departures in Colony for which there is no clear justification, and they feel to Stan and others like mistakes, inconsistencies that undermine the novel's accomplishment. But by and large, as it's the spirit and not the specifics of Newfoundland Johnson is after, he gets away with taking liberties when they animate that spirit. History is one of the materials at Johnson's disposal, but he is not writing history. As Stan puts it, he is introducing history to the sea change by which it turns into myth. Unfortunately for me, I had finished writing my first novel when Stan gave the 2001 Pratt Lecture. It would have offered me some helpful ways to think about the questions I was wrestling with through that process. What do I owe to the history and the historical figures I was writing about? What are the limits to the liberties that can be taken? River Thieves is set in the early years of the 19th century, at the point when it's becoming clear to some of the European settlers in Newfoundland that the Beothuk are in trouble. and the extermination of a whole race of people is a real possibility. It details some of the well-meaning, though condescending and completely ineffectual attempts to establish friendly contact with the few surviving Beothuk. But from the outset, I made up my mind that I was not going to write a book about the Beothuk. There are a number of novels written from the Beothuk perspective, attempting to present these people from the inside, how they saw the world, what they made of what was happening to them. To my mind, that kind of project had always seemed completely wrong-headed. The point of the Beothuk story, of the fact of their extinction, is that we can't and will never know these things. So the Beothuk and river thieves exist largely in the margins of the book, just as they had in the margins of official concerns at the time. Readers are, like the European characters in the novel, forced to guess at the thoughts and motivations and fears and beliefs of these people from the little we see of their actions. The resulting picture is partial and contradictory and riddled with holes, and it could not be otherwise. To pretend I might resurrect them in fiction, that I could make them live again on the page somehow, would belittle the magnitude of the loss. As far as I could see, it was just one more thing that could be done to them. But I had a very different approach when it came to the European characters in the novel, most of whom are based on historical figures. But like the colony of Unrequited Dreams, my book is not history. It takes liberties with known facts in order to make a story of past events. One example, there are 3 expeditions down the Exploits River to make contact with the Beothuk in the novel. All are based on actual expeditions. The real John Peyton Jr., the source of one of the book's main characters, was still living in England when the first expedition was undertaken. But to make the novel work, to give it a satisfying narrative arc, I felt John Peyton Jr. had to be involved in all 3 expeditions. So I mucked with the facts to put him there. Now, there are ways to do this kind of mucking and still maintain some fidelity to the history. In this case, I didn't allow Peyton Jr.'s presence to influence or alter any of what we know happened on that expedition. So we learn some things about his character, about his relationship to other people in the story during the trip. But the events of the expedition are those of the historical record. These kinds of shenanigans are at work throughout the novel, trading off narrative and aesthetic concerns with a desire to, as much as possible, stay true to the historical story. And for the most part, it seemed like a fairly satisfactory transaction. Where I found myself struggling, and where Wayne Johnson came in for most of his criticism, was in the process of fictionalizing the lives of actual people. Although the historical record is fairly clear about what these people did, there's a lot more gray area when it comes to the question of why they did what they did. And this is the place where novels do what straight history cannot, creating interior lives, motivations, foibles, desires, and fears for the dead, making visible the dark matter at the heart of human history that we can sense but otherwise cannot see or touch. Building that illusion of intimacy is a tricky and exhilarating process. But taking the liberties necessary to make it happen made me really uneasy. These were individuals with elaborate and completely unknowable private lives that I was appropriating to my own ends. And I wasn't sure I could make peace with using the defenseless dead in this way. There's a murder at the outset of the novel that the Peytons are responsible for. And a naval officer, Captain David Buchan, is sent to investigate. Buchan records his interviews and theories in a notebook, and John Peyton arranges to have it stolen, hoping to find something in there that he can use to protect his family. But even before he opens that journal, he realizes the futility of that hope. Given the magnitude of what his family is intimately tied to, the extirpation of an entire race of people, there is nothing he can do to protect him or his family from the judgment of future generations. At this point in the book, he recalls an incident from his first years in Newfoundland when he and his father came upon a Beothuk burial site. And this is from the novel. The afternoon he and John Sr. had uncovered the skeleton of the dead Indian on Swan Island, His father opened the tiny medicine bag, then offered it to Peyton. A keepsake, he'd called it. Peyton looked at the stained pouch and then at his father. He refused to take it. John Sr. set the bag on the ground between his feet. There was an amused look of surprise on his face. He reached a huge gnarled hand and closed it around the skull of the Indian man. He lifted it clear of the frame and then gathered up the jawbone as well, holding the two together at the joint. He flapped them back and forth and spoke under this mime in a low-pitched voice. "Just a dead Indian," the skull said. "Nothing to bother your head about." Peyton could feel the violation in that act, putting words so carelessly and callously in the mouth of the dead. He turned Buchan's journal in circles on the table. He would find himself in there, and the men who made up the party to the lake, but not, he was sure, in the fashion they had conspired to present themselves. There were things he had seen and heard in his days he vowed to take to his grave, as if that was a safe place for the truth. But 200 years from now, he knew, some stranger could raise his bones from the earth and put whatever words they liked in his mouth. That's me, John Peyton is worrying about there. It's me he is pointing to out of the pages of the novel, to say to the reader, don't be fooled into thinking these words are mine. No one could ever know the truth of who I was or what I thought or how I felt about what was happening. This is a novel written by a guy in his underwear in an attic room in Kingston, Ontario, in the year of our Lord, 1999. Don't for a moment think I have consented to this. I don't think I could have published the novel without including this opportunity for the real John Peyton to call me out. And even so, I still have qualms about the whole business. Last year, I was tagged in a tweet by someone who goes by the handle @PricklyShark. Everything I know about Newfoundland, the tweet read, I learned from reading books by @Michael Crummey. My one-word response was #uh-oh. I have spent my adult life writing stories set in Newfoundland, all of them in one way or another about Newfoundland, trying to explain the world I come from to myself, trying to be true to its social and historical realities to thicken the real of the place. So I suppose the notion that Prickly Shark is out there seeing Newfoundland through my particular lens should have made me happy. But instead, it just brought me back to that vexing question about the relationship between fiction and truth. Clearly, slapping the phrase "a novel" on a book's cover isn't cover enough for some readers. And it's disconcerting to think I might be a person's only window on a place and a culture so complex and contested, given the fact that the mirror I am holding up is webbed with cracks, some intentional, others decidedly not. There are no raccoons in River Thieves, but honeybees play a pivotal role in what was one of my favorite scenes in the book. Years after it was published, a reader wrote to tell me there are no honeybees in Newfoundland. Never have been. But you'll find them in the novel still, spurious, specious, and large as life. And I can only imagine what else I may have screwed up or misrepresented over the course of 30 years of writing. Oh, and that story about Lisa Moore's friends shunning her husband because they assumed he'd had an affair. I heard it years ago when I first moved home to Newfoundland from Ontario, but I honestly don't know if there's any truth to it. I keep meaning to ask Lisa about that. It feels true. And it's a good story, whether or not it actually happened. I guess the romantic in me still wants to say a good story is any story that feels true to the reader. And for many people, I imagine that is the only measure that matters. But the entire point of this lecture, as far as it can be said to have one, has been to add one proviso to that romantic notion. On some level, all creative writing is an act of appropriation. An appropriation of the real to our own individual and often inscrutable ends. And in that process, despite our best intentions, or because of them, there are inevitable distortions and adjustments and blind spots and mistakes that snake their way in, even where writers aren't being nakedly exploitative. Their relationship to the truth, to what we think of as the real world, can't help but be provisional, can't help but be subjective. And we would do well to keep that in mind, regardless of how convincing a book is. What I should have said to Prickly Shark is this: thank you for reading. Most of what you know about Newfoundland is true. Thank you.
Public figures versus your own family history.
How is it different to write about public figures as opposed to writing about family? And I think the only difference, you have to live with your family. If you're writing about public figures, I mean, there's always the chance that you'll meet relatives of those public figures and that sort of thing. The fact that these figures are public makes them fair game in a way. That opens them up to being used as material by anybody. When you're writing about family, I think the real difference is they didn't sign up for that. There can be a real sense of betrayal, I think, if people feel like they're being exposed to the world. And even if it's not anything bad that you're saying about your family. Michael Winter tells this amazing story about his brother, who he writes about in all of his short stories. Again, it's fiction, but everybody knows it's his brother. This All Happened is the name of one of his books, and it did all happen. His brother at one point came to Michael and said, "You're writing about me, and there's this one story where you write about my dog, and it's an image of the dog on the dashboard and how the dog's nose leaves prints on the windshield when the car slows." For Michael's brother, that was the breaking point. And he threatened him. He basically said, "If you write about me again, I'm going to beat the shit out of you," I think is more or less what he said. There's no way for Michael to know that that image was going to be the one that made his brother feel like he was being exposed to the world in a way that he was not happy with. And I think you never know when you're writing about family where that line is. You're playing with fire to do that. I've written about my family quite a bit in the early books, in particular in a book called Hard Light, which it's kind of a love letter to my dad and to the world that he grew up in. I've been incredibly lucky because my parents were always really supportive, even though I was writing about them quite a bit. I wasn't revealing any deep, dark secrets or anything like that, so I think that I got some grace because of that. But apparently my dad did say to my mother one time, "Well, you got to watch what you say to them." Because you don't know where it might end up. I mean, I think the wisest course of action for writers is to not do it. But for a lot of writers, that's impossible. Like, that is the thing that made them who they are, and therefore writing about it is essential. So I just say good luck to them.
You talk about fidelity. An Albertan who has unfortunately never been to Newfoundland, I want to know if we can believe the travel Newfoundland and Labrador advertisements that we see on television. It never rains.
Actually, they finally put out one where there is some rain. But that's a great question, because those ads are fantastic.
They are.
That's the best ad campaign I've ever seen in my life. My wife and I were sitting watching television one time, and one of those ads came on, and I said to her, "I don't know where that is, but I want to live there." So, no, you can't believe them. They do a great job, I think, of capturing the romance of the place, the things about Newfoundland that people come away from it saying, "This is what I love about having visited." But they do it by saturating all the green colors to the max. Bring a raincoat if you go, please.
how much you can distort geographical facts. I've written a book about sabotage in World War II on the Saguenay, and I have caves in it, and I've not been able to find out if there are caves. I know there's caves on the St. Maurice, but can I get away with that?
If I was your reader, yes. That's always the thing. Like, it really is a question of who is reading the book and what do they bring to the book. A lot of people would read The Bird Artist and come away thinking, well, that's the way it is in Newfoundland. That's how people live. So if people are reading your book who don't know that area or who don't know whether or not there are caves, then that could fly. And if it's not important to you to be completely scrupulously, if it's more important to the story to have those caves, and you're not interested in that absolute scrupulously staying to the fact, then I would say go for it. But be prepared to get letters.
In your lecture, you referred to the novel form. You've done a fair bit of poetry. Are there different rules, different perspectives that you consider when you're writing poetry in light of your presentation tonight?
I think for me, and I'm sure this is different for every writer, but for me there are different things I'm after when I'm writing poetry than what I'm after when I'm writing fiction. Poetry for me has always been deeply personal. That's the place where if I'm writing about my family, generally that's where it comes out, or about my own life. When I was writing that book about Dad and the world that he came from, I did feel a requirement to try and learn as much about that world as I could to make it feel authentic. So that was present there. But generally, it's something different that I'm after. And with the novels, I think the bar is much higher because I want the novels to be as authentic as possible. I don't want there to be any place where a reader, hits a detail and thinks, oh, that's not true. That's not the way things were, because that throws people out of the book. And it's impossible to have it 100% all the time. You know, I did get a letter from someone who read River Thieves and said, you used the word trek, and it didn't come into the English language until after the events that you describe. And I think, okay, there's one guy I think he was writing from Denmark or something, and I thought, okay, that's okay for me. I can live with that. I have a different sense of what I'm after when I'm writing the poetry. And maybe it's because I'm writing out of my own life more, so there's less that I don't know, right? There's less that I have to go looking for. It's all more in front of me.
I thought there was a universal quality to that novel, and the details about Newfoundland didn't matter so much to me as the quality of the people there. I found the novel really powerful emotionally, and when the dog dies, I actually found myself in tears. That as
Right.
unemotional character is losing his dog, I found myself crying. It reminded me so much of my father and my uncles and the other men I grew up around. And to me, all those little details of having things perfect about Newfoundland didn't matter so much because the characters were so emotional and so powerful and so universal. And they could have been anywhere. They could have been lots of other places and lots of other people.
A lot of people were mad at me because of what happened to the dog. And so I should say the dog is alive and well. That was my dog. And he was on my lap while I was writing that book. He's great. It's interesting what you say about Moses Sweetland. He is a man who, on the surface, is completely unemotional and completely unattached to or unable to access his emotions in some ways. It's been interesting to see people's reaction to him in terms of people from Newfoundland reacting to Moses and people from the mainland reacting to Moses. Not a lot of people, but I was surprised at how many people on the mainland who'd read the book who didn't like him and thought that he was not a nice man. I have never met anyone from Newfoundland who thought that. And it's because everybody knew who he was. And there's a particular Newfoundland man, an Outport man, who is completely unable to express his emotions in a particular way, in a particularly obvious way. Everybody knows how they feel about everything. Like there are other ways that they find. My father was like this. All of the older men I grew up around were like this. They connect with people through like teasing and making fun of them. They use backhanded compliments. That's the only kind they ever give out. But there is no doubting how they feel about you. Because it's unspoken in so many ways, it creates a bond that's incredibly intense and powerful. That was what I was attempting to create in that figure of Moses. Certainly for people in Newfoundland, that seems to have resonated, and thankfully for some people on the mainland as well. Anyway, that's a lot of me. Enough. Thank you again so much for coming, and thank you, Maureen, for having me.